Hello learners, welcome to the second lecture in this NPTEL course on the 20th century women's novel. I have begun introducing this course by providing a very brief and generalized summary of the major concerns in feminist literary criticism in the previous lecture. Towards the end of the previous lecture, I began by talking about some points of disagreement and alignment between this tradition, that is feminist literary criticism, and another tradition, which is literary criticism focused on the history of the English novel. Some points of difference I was discussing, and I will continue discussing those differences. And I will follow that up with a discussion of two major works that focus on the history of the rise of the novel from a literary historical perspective in which questions of identity are less important. I have also discussed in the previous lecture how and why questions of identity remain very important for a feminist literary criticism. These questions tend to be subordinated in other approaches. In this course, however, we will integrate both of these approaches. A focus on literary history, which will allow us to cover novels and writers from a wide range of geographical and historical contexts, even though we will obey the strict boundaries of the 20th century. Additionally, by focusing on novels by women writers, we will also foreground the question of identity in the way that feminist criticism has taught us. So questions of who is speaking, who is spoken for, and how different narrative techniques internalize these dynamics between speaking and being spoken for. This is a key concern in the discussion on representation, and we will find ways of making it matter for a feminist criticism. So, to wrap up the discussion of the points of difference between feminist criticism and literary history tends to focus on universal ideas, such as the rise of individualism. In the case of Ian Watt's book, The Rise of the Novel, Watt describes the rise of formal realism and the rise of specific, detailed descriptions of real individuals in real historical settings. This is a defining feature of the novels of the 18th century, a feature that inspires Watt to call them by the name of a new literary genre, that of the English novel. From a feminist and post-colonial perspective, less important is the question of universal identity, and more important is particular experiences, how individuals experience reality because of their gender, because of their race, because of their affiliation to colonized or post-colonial countries or nationalities. These differences, these particular experiences matter more, and they cannot be reduced to any universal idea of a modern subject. Literary history and feminist criticism also have different ways of thinking about the canon. In literary history, there is often a very clearly defined idea of a literary canon. A literary canon, as all of you know, I'm sure, is a set of writers and works which are considered to be exemplary or definitive of English literature. For instance, there are many courses on English literature that make it mandatory for students to study plays by William Shakespeare, for instance, or novels by Jane Austen. In this case, Shakespeare and Austen are canonical writers. Their works are part of the canon of English literature. It's a religious idea, and it comes from the organization of certain texts as canonical in the Christian church. This idea has come down to the study of literature as well. A feminist criticism often challenges ideas of the canon which have been created and consolidated with a dominant masculine perspective. So, many feminist critics argue that a focus only on great authors, quote unquote, ensures that only certain male writers are studied, and such a focus on great authors ends up inadvertently obscuring or not paying attention to and not recognizing the work of several innovative and compelling and powerful women writers. Not just women writers, but also traditions of writing in which women participated more actively. In order to give adequate and equitable recognition to both women's experiences as well as the kinds of writing women were more likely to produce and consume, feminist critics challenge ideas of canon and argue for a more democratized redefinition of the canon with the inclusion of female and women writers. The difference between feminist criticism and literary history also comes down to a difference between politics and aesthetics. Many literary historians treat the question of politics as not germane to a study of literature. And here also feminist criticism differs because feminist criticism insists that there is no possible study of intellectual or literary traditions without an understanding of the political struggles from which these writings emerged. And it's not just that all literature emerges out of a struggle, but literature and literary production is always connected to struggles. Sometimes certain writers or certain individuals who fail or who end up on the losing side of a political struggle find their voices removed or excluded from literary history. And feminist criticism argues that often the voices of women writers who were confined to domestic spaces and not often invited to take part in intellectual duties were often excluded because the voice of reason and the voice of intellect was often taken over by men who performed public roles outside the house. So it becomes important from a feminist criticism not only to read the writings of women as they undertook domestic labor, but also to think about the way domestic labor defines human identity and how the political struggle for women to gain freedoms, to gain reproductive freedoms, which would enable and give them the right to work in public spaces and not just be confined to domestic spaces. These struggles were important subjects of study for literary history as well. Novels by women who did not undertake domestic labor, or novels by women which described the problems or the contradictions of domestic labor, these were important subjects of literary study according to feminist criticism. Now, the 20th century is a very, very appropriate period in which these concerns can be examined. The aesthetic innovation of the 20th century novel is best understood in dialogue with the kind of identity politics and the kind of questions that women writers were asking from their nations, from their families, from the dominant forces in society in the 20th century. The question of post-colonial and queer criticism is also important. Once these approaches to literature arose, they were not exactly identical with feminist criticism, but they had very strong affinities with feminist criticism. I have already discussed the work of Chandra Mohanty and Gayatri Spivak, a work which constitutes post-colonial feminism. In addition to that, there is also a very important body of writing which we can call queer criticism, which complicates identity further by linking gender with questions of empire, sexuality, and race. Now, before we go further, I want to talk about two influential works by scholars in the history of literature, which approach the English novel and also the European novel as an important object of literary history. Questions of identity are less important. However, these two works are quite important for understanding how the 20th century novel emerged. The first scholar whose work I will examine is Franco Moretti. Franco Moretti is known for the concept of distant reading and, somewhat related to this, the macro history of literature. Moretti pioneered distant reading, which is a method that uses computational tools and statistical models to analyze large-scale literary patterns. So instead of focusing on one novel, instead of tracing the structure or the patterns or language or character of one novel, Franco Moretti designed tools using computers and programs which could examine the electronic copies of tens, hundreds, and sometimes more than 1,000 individual novels analyzed together. This was before the days of LLMs, and so it was quite a unique breakthrough, combining computational tools as well as literary close reading. The book Graphs, Maps, and Trees emphasizes abstract modeling of literary history. It quantifies the rise of the novel as a genre. It gives different models and graphs for studying how the novel spread from one part of the globe to another, that is, from 18th or 19th century England to Asia, Africa, different nations in South Asia, Latin America, and so on. Moretti is able to map these processes, which involve the tracing of trends observed over thousands of novels by using graphs. Similarly, in works like the Atlas of the European Novel, Moretti uses maps to plot how different characters move in different parts of different actual geographical spaces. So, for instance, in his book Atlas of the European Novel, Moretti has maps drawn for the city of London, for different parts of England, including the countryside, and uses these maps to plot the trajectory of different characters. For instance, there are maps in Atlas of the European Novel which map the movement of a character from Charles Dickens' novel Bleak House. There are also maps which trace different aspects of novels, such as Barbara Mitford's novel about the pastoral countryside. So this is a very important quantitative kind of literary criticism. It is focused on the English novel. It is focused on the history of literature. It tries to connect the English novel to texts that emerged before it, and it places the English novel in a wide geographical canvas. Moretti's book, The Bourgeois, takes a different approach and takes a somewhat traditional literary historical approach. In this book, Moretti argues that class was a very important factor in the development of the English novel. Money or mercantile interests, the stability, the financial comfort of the middle class, it was a very, very important force in 18th and 19th centuries Europe. And Franco Moretti shows how writers came from this class, the protagonists of novels also came from this class, and the stories of personal growth, stories of individual characters developing across time, evolving over the passage of time. These stories were actually mirroring stories of economic growth and consolidation. So, who was growing and consolidating? The business classes, the middle classes who began to start small businesses and began to grow financially more powerful as well as secure in the 18th century. As European societies transitioned from traditional feudal monarchies to republican societies with relatively open markets, relatively open competition, it became possible for individuals to grow financially outside the control of royal powers or monarchical powers. And so this kind of an economic history led to the rise in the growth of characters and individuals like Daniel Defoe, who were able to write novels reflecting such growth. And this is exactly what we find in the story of Robinson Crusoe. So Franco Moretti has a brilliant reading of Robinson Crusoe in The Bourgeois. In fact, it is the first chapter, the first major discussion of literary text in the book The Bourgeois. This book is directly inspired by histories of English novels. It is also directly inspired by scholarly accounts of the European novel, mainly George Lukács's book on the historical novel. But in this kind of an inquiry, questions of identity and questions of gendered identity are less important. Moretti's work exemplifies the structural emphasis of literary history. That is, it identifies long-term patterns. how certain ways of using sentences, certain ways of using verbs, certain ways of using action words. And Moretti has a long discussion of the gerund. The gerund is a noun that has evolved from a verb. For Moretti, it shows how action, activity, business, economic transactions began to grow in their density as well as intensity across the 18th and 19th centuries. And this can be seen in the sentence structure, which was made popular in the 18th and 19th century English novel. So, from sentence structure to centuries long patterns of economic growth, all of these are part of Moretti's evidence. Market dynamics, as well as the structural evolution of form and genre. These are all important, but individual subjectivity is not important for Franco Moretti. Now, this can help us understand how Moretti's work is actually very different from the kind of approach taken by many feminist literary critics. The questions of gender, race, sexuality, and intersectional identity are almost completely absent from Moretti's account. Questions of distant reading, which take the text of many novels together and plot them or make diagrams, visual representations of them. They risk obscuring marginalized voices in favor of patterns visible across large corpora. Now, another key scholar whose work is very important, who takes a very different approach from that of Franco Moretti, is Edwin Frank. Now, Edwin Frank's book, Stranger Than Fiction, Lives of the 20th Century Novel, was published in the year 2024 and is among the most remarkable and influential books of literary history that focuses on the 20th century novel. Now, Frank offers a chronological, descriptive, and contextual account of modern fiction. Edwin Frank is the editorial director of the New York Review of Books publisher. That is, Edwin Frank decides what books are published under the imprint of the New York Review of Books, also the New York Review of Books Classics series. Frank declares that this book is not an English professor's account, and Edwin Frank brings an editor's encyclopedic knowledge to the experience of reading an English novel. So this book, Stranger Than Fiction, Lives of the 20th Century Novel, is aimed not at providing an authoritative chronological account of which are the most important novels. No, that's not what this book is. This book is a chronological description of what it feels like to read the 20th century English novel. Edwin Frank provides detailed accounts of 37 novels. 37 novels, they are arranged in a chronological order, but the thesis or the defining argument or the narrative thread which connects them is not one that has any kind of an interpretive thesis. Edwin Frank does not believe that there is any unifying idea that is common to all 20th century novels. It's not that authors who wrote novels in the 20th century had a common set of concerns. In fact, what Edwin Frank's book argues for is that the 20th century was a time of great fragmentation. It was a time that was shaped by great chaos. It was a time that was defined by great violence. The First World War is usually considered to be the defining event of the 20th century. The First World War shattered many traditional values. It also shattered many traditional assumptions about the kind of formal technique language could be used to create. It also shattered many formal techniques of writing novels and telling stories in the form of an omniscient narrator's voice. This is the reason why, in Edwin Frank's perspective, many popular and influential novelists do not make the cut. So, post-war American novelists, for instance, writers like Saul Bellow, for instance, do not make the cut, even though Saul Bellow is a very widely read and influential 20th century novelist. The reason for that according to Frank, is that Saul Bellows novels do not really shatter the mold or break down the traditional structure of the English novel as it was practiced in the 19th century. So Saul Bellows novels do not reflect the disorientation that the novel form underwent in the 20th century. Frank's study emphasizes how novels like Mrs. Dalloway or Ulysses by James Joyce, or more experimental hybrids, integrate history, myth, memoir, and they disrupted narrative forms, and thereby they captured the fragmented consciousness of the century. Frank's methodology is accessible and passionate. It is free of jargon and focused on how novels feel, how it feels like to read certain novels. And that is also why it is very different from an academic account. And this is a book that reflects how novels become barometers of evolving material and political conditions for authors and readers. Frank's approach aligns with traditional literary history. He situates major novels within their historical context, traces formal innovations, and foregrounds temporal, cultural, and social conditions shaping literary consciousness. Now, there are, however, differences between Frank's approach and that of feminist criticism, which focuses more directly on identity. So while Frank discusses authors like Virginia Woolf or other women writers, his approach often emphasizes the novel's response to broader historical crises and instead does not focus or is less concerned with attending to how the particularity of female subjectivity, gendered identity, or intersectionality, how these things compel the narrator or the author to develop a new narrative technique. So Frank is less concerned with questioning how identity inspires the growth or the evolution of new forms. Frank is more concerned with tracing how different writers drew on different creative impulses to respond to the problems of fragmentation that the 20th century was struggling with. Feminist critics, on the other hand, might push deeper into the connection between gender and representation in those same texts, arguing, for instance, that narrative fragmentation speaks not just to modern alienation, but also to female interiority under patriarchy. Okay. Now, we have spent quite a bit of time discussing these two approaches, a literary historical approach and a feminist critical approach. And the chief difference between these two approaches is the emphasis on identity. Now, before we launch into the life and work of the first novelist in this course, I will provide a brief case study, a lightly comparative study of two novels, in fact. And in this discussion that wraps up this lecture, I will reflect some of the ideas we have discussed earlier. So the first case study is the most iconic 20th century English novel by a woman writer. This is Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf, which was published in the year 1925. This novel is widely studied. In fact, I have discussed this novel in my own NPTEL course on the English novel, which is why I have not included a detailed study of this novel in this course, because this course is an opportunity to look outside, to include voices and writers and texts that have traditionally not received as much attention as a canonical writer like Virginia Woolf has received. So this novel, Mrs. Dalloway, follows one individual, Clarissa Dalloway, over the course of a single day in post-World War I London. She is preparing for a party, right? And interwoven with Clarissa's perspective is that of Septimus Warren Smith, a shell-shocked veteran who has been contemplating suicide. Through a narrative technique that retrospectively has been called stream of consciousness, the narrator of Woolf's novel moves extremely fluidly and sometimes quite shockingly, because readers are not given adequate notice, moves quite fluidly between memory and present experience, private thoughts of public events, ultimately converging the lives of Clarissa and Septimus at her evening party. Now, In many ways, this is the ideal novel or the ideal object of analysis for feminist literary criticism with its focus on identity. Female subjectivity and domestic space are extremely important for any study of this novel. Woolf presents Clarissa as both constrained by and ambivalent towards marriage, motherhood, and respectability. The novel critiques patriarchal social structures while exploring how Clarissa carves out private mental space, the room of one's own, in Woolf's words, which Woolf later argued was indispensable if a woman had to have an identity, a career, and a life of her own. These things are also important, as are the representation of desire, memory, and reflection. There is queerness in this novel as well. Clarissa's remembered intimacy with Sally Seton hints at queerness, suggesting forms of female subjectivity that are beyond the scope of a heteronormative and reproductive sexuality. Yet, Clarissa also performs the role of the perfect hostess, embodying these tensions between public conformity and private subjectivity. This subjectivity can articulate longing, but the focus of the novel, and this is the uniqueness of the narrative technique that the narrator has evolved, is that these longings, these subjectivities, are kept private and they are managed or balanced with extremely opposed political and cultural sensibilities. Clarissa Dalloway is a hostess who does not give voice to these radical impulses. And it is only the reader of this novel who pays attention to the ways in which the narrator shifts, moves, glides, as it were, between temporal and spatial contexts. It is only that attuned and sensitive reader who can sense that there are a wide range of identities, multitudes. I contain multitudes, as Walt Whitman wrote. Virginia Woolf narrator contains multitudes within these techniques of streams of consciousnus. Now, there is also a great deal of discussion and reflection of post-war modernity. The First World War haunts London through Septimus's shell shock and the omnipresence of death. Clarissa's party, seemingly apolitical, becomes an act of gathering life against historical rupture. There is also a great deal of reflection of the 20th century influenza pandemic. Recently, scholars such as Elizabeth Oatka have begun to pay attention to how Virginia Woolf represents sickness and fever and colds and things like that. So it is very, very possible to read Mrs. Dalloway as a reflection of the history and the complicated histories and ways in which history was remembered of the 20th century. However, the key thing that the narrator of this novel does is that it ensures that any means of accessing this complex history of the 20th century must pass through an acknowledgement and a reckoning with the necessarily female identity of its protagonist, through whose consciousness most of the novel is narrated. Actually, Clarissa is one of the two protagonists. The other is Septimus Smith. Septimus Smith is not a woman, but it is the intersectional nature of Septimus's identity which connects him to the questions of identity that feminist criticism has been exploring. Septimus Smith is a man, but he is a veteran of the First World War. He has suffered trauma and shell shock from fighting in the war, has gone quite mad, keeps reflecting, keeps remembering his comrades from the war, frequently narrates poems, and often contemplates suicide. In his departure from normative behavior, Septimus reminds readers that identity is fluid, fragmented, and quite multifaceted. No one's identity can be defined by any one category at any point. So it is an extremely intersectional representation of identity which this novel provides. Now, a scholar like Edwin Frank might stress how the fragmented form and temporal compression reflect the 20th century's crisis of representation. And in fact, Virginia Woolf herself reflected many times and wrote many times on how 20th century modes of narration and writing were different from Victorian modes of narration and storytelling. For Franco Moretti, looking at the century macroscopically, they might be more interested in tracing how modernist techniques such as interior monologues and temporal dislocation emerged globally. So while Virginia Woolf was writing in a stream of consciousness technique, what were other writers doing at the same time? Writers in India, say, or the Philippines. And in fact, Moretti writes about Tagore or Jose Rizal, who are writers in the early 20th century who were experimenting with literary form in their own ways. There is a tension with identity politics because these historical readings might overlook how fragmentation itself encodes gendered experience. Mrs. Dalloway is about the hostess, the wife, the queer woman, each negotiating modernity differently than the soldier or statesman. But also, there are great similarities between each of these identities. Three of these actually are contained in the figure, in the person of the same human being, the same woman, that is Clarissa. Another novel that I will mention briefly before wrapping up this lecture is the novel Wide Sargasso Sea, published in the year 1966 by the novelist Jean Rhys. This is a post-colonial novel. It is identifiably post-colonial because it is written as a prequel to Charlotte Bronte's classic Victorian novel Jane Eyre. Wide Sargasso Sea tells the story of Antoinette Causeway, a Creole heiress in 19th century Jamaica, whose marriage to an Englishman, later identified as Mr. Rochester, a character from Jane Eyre, ends in betrayal and madness. The novel, Jean Rhys's novel Wide Sargasso Sea, traces Antoinette's childhood amid racial tensions after emancipation, her ill-fated marriage, and eventual confinement in England, where she becomes the mad woman in the attic of Charlotte Bronte's novel. So, in Charlotte Bronte's novel, we see an unnamed character named Bertha Mason, who inflicts a great deal of violence on characters such as Mr. Rochester. Bertha Mason is Rochester's first wife. She is the woman Rochester is forced to marry in a way because he wants to secure a financial gain. That is, he wants to grow his family's business in the Caribbean. And because of this, he is forced into this marriage and he drags with him this Creole woman to England, where she goes quite mad, and quite naturally so, given the entire lack of agency, the lack of choice, and forcibly transported from the place of her birth, from her native land, to a foreign alien land which was quite cold and strange, and where people looked different and spoke a very strange language. So in Jane Eyre, Bertha Mason is described in a monstrous and horrific manner. Scholars such as Gayatri Spivak have demonstrated how this was part of Victorian England's unconscious dark side, that violence in the Caribbean was the price of prosperity in Victorian England. And Jane Eyre, Charlotte Bronte's novel, focuses on the identity and the struggles of women like Jane Eyre, but it entirely neglects or evades the engagement with questions of privilege because it fails to acknowledge how the struggles that white women like Jane experienced were still reflections of privilege compared to the struggles of Creole, black, and brown women like Bertha Mason. It is this ignorance, it is this privilege, it is this unconscious universalization of privilege as struggle that Charlotte Bronte's novel enacts. It is this privilege which Jean Rhys's novel responds to and rewrites in Jean Rhys's words in Wide Sargasso Sea. So the character who is a monster in Jane Eyre is described as a real human being with real problems and who was confined and trapped despite her best efforts in extremely difficult situations. This is a novel that is again a very prime candidate for feminist literary criticism. It describes a colonial and racialized feminist identity. Rees gives voice to a woman who was black and who was silenced in Jane Eyre. Thereby, Rees's novel exposes how race, gender, and colonialism intertwine in Antoinette's dispossession. Feminist critics read her voice as reclaiming female subjectivity from both patriarchy and empire. Antoinette, the protagonist of Jean Rhys's novel, occupies a liminal space. That is, she's both white and Creole. She's both wealthy and socially precarious after emancipation. She's both female in a patriarchal marriage market, but also quite powerful and has the opportunity to inflict violence on others who have less agency than her. Her identity disintegrates under racialized and gendered power. It disintegrates into its multiple constituent parts. I will stop this discussion here and continue reflecting on the differences, the points of disagreement and alignment between feminist criticism and a literary historical approach to the novel. I will also introduce the first novel and novelist that we will study in this course in the next lecture. Thank you.